This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about something quieter, more dangerous. It's about what happens when rules still exist on paper but stop working in real life. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Systems don't fail all at once. They fail when enforcement becomes optional, when consequences slow down, when authority speaks and nothing happens. Most people assume collapse looks loud, sirens, votes, crowds. But the real damage starts earlier, in silence, in procedure, in moments most people don't watch. Tonight, I'm not asking you to pick a side. I'm asking you to stay with me. Because if you look away at the wrong moment, you miss the point where the system stops correcting itself. And once that happens, everything else accelerates. What matters next is not who acted, but what the system did when it was tested. And that's where this story actually begins. Most people think power lives in people. Presidents, judges, legislators, faces, names, elections. That assumption is wrong. Real power lives somewhere else. It lives in enforcement. Not laws, not rulings, not even the Constitution itself. Enforcement is the quiet force that turns words into limits. It's the difference between an order and a suggestion, between authority and performance. Every system depends on it. Courts issue commands because they assume compliance will follow. Not instantly, not perfectly, but eventually. That assumption is the load-bearing beam. And here's the shift most people missed. Over time, enforcement didn't disappear. It became negotiable. Warnings replaced penalties. Delays replaced consequences. Escalation became procedural instead of real. On paper, nothing changed. In practice, everything did. Because once a system hesitates to enforce against power, power learns something dangerous. It learns it can wait. And once waiting works, the system is no longer in control. What comes next is how that lesson was taught, slowly, quietly, and legally. The most dangerous changes don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with speeches or votes. They arrive disguised as normal. There was a time when defiance was rare, when violating an order triggered escalation. Fast, predictable, unavoidable. Before, delay was a risk. Now delay is a strategy. Before, power reacted to the system. Now, the system reacts to power. This didn't happen overnight. It happened through repetition. Each exception justified as unique. Each violation treated as manageable. Each consequence softened to avoid disruption. And slowly, a new baseline formed. Not lawlessness, something more subtle. A world where rules still exist, but only apply if enforcement feels convenient. A world where procedure replaces restraint, where compliance becomes optional for those who can absorb the cost. This is how normalization works, not by breaking the system, but by teaching it to tolerate strain. And once tolerance replaces limits, the system starts protecting itself from enforcement. That's when the warning lights should have gone on. But they didn't, because the first visible shock always comes later. The moment didn't look like a collapse. It looked procedural, a document, filed, stamped, routine almost. But inside it was something the system had never admitted before. An authority saying, in plain language, I am out of tools. Not frustrated, not angry, exhausted. Orders had been issued, ignored, warnings delivered, dismissed, penalties applied, absorbed, again and again and again. This wasn't a single breach. It was accumulation, pattern, intent. And that's the part that changes everything, because systems are designed to handle mistakes. They are not designed to handle deliberate defiance that carries no cost. So the escalation happened sideways, not upward, not louder, but outward. Responsibility passed to another branch, not as a preference, as a necessity. This wasn't accountability working. It was containment failing. And once failure becomes visible on paper, it stops being local. That's when the pressure spreads. Here's how the system is supposed to work. One branch acts, another checks it, a third enforces the boundary. But that design assumes something fragile. That enforcement always escalates faster than defiance. When that assumption breaks, damage doesn't land where you expect. The system doesn't punish the defiant actor first. It shifts the cost elsewhere. Courts hesitate because force undermines legitimacy. Legislatures delay because action looks political. Executives stall because enforcement carries risk. So the burden moves downward, onto procedure, onto delay, onto ambiguity. Those with power learn to exploit this gap. They violate just enough to test limits. They absorb fines like operating expenses. They turn warnings into signals. Each response teaches them where the ceiling really is. Meanwhile, everyone else absorbs the damage. The institution loses credibility. Compliance erodes across unrelated cases. Authority thins. No one votes for this outcome. No one declares it. It emerges when enforcement becomes optional for the strong and mandatory only for the compliant. And once that asymmetry locks in, the system starts protecting power instead of restraining it. That's when the next shock stops being hypothetical. Then the system speeds up, not because it wants to, because it has to. Defiance increases. Violations stack, signals get louder, response windows shrink. What used to take weeks now takes hours. What used to be internal becomes public. What used to be hypothetical becomes operational. Security appears, barriers rise, language hardens. Every move is defensive. Nothing is corrective. This is the danger zone, where enforcement hasn't returned, but escalation has already begun. Power tests the boundary again and again. Each test forces the system to react faster, with fewer tools, under more pressure. Mistakes become irreversible. Options collapse. The system is no longer deciding. It's bracing. And when institutions brace, they stop asking whether something should happen and start asking whether they can survive it. That's the shift most people miss. Because it looks like activity, it feels like action. But it's not control. It's containment under stress. And the next consequence doesn't land on paper. It lands on people. Here's where this stops being abstract. Because enforcement failure doesn't stay inside institutions. It leaks. It reaches you through delays that never resolve, through rules that apply unevenly, through a sense that consequences are negotiable as long as you're not the one negotiating. You feel it when process replaces outcome, when accountability becomes something that happens later, or maybe never. You adjust without realizing it, you lower expectations, you stop trusting timelines, you assume nothing actually ends. That's not apathy, that's adaptation. And systems notice adaptation. They begin to rely on it. This is how normalization spreads, not by force, by fatigue. If you've felt that quiet recalibration, that sense that something fundamental has shifted, that's not imagination. That's the cost being passed to you. And this is the moment most people look away, because it's uncomfortable to admit, but staying with it matters. Because what happens next doesn't reverse pressure, it redistributes it. And once it moves beyond borders, it stops being containable. Systems don't fail in isolation, they broadcast. When enforcement weakens at the center, every connected system recalculates. Allies watch for reliability. Markets watch for predictability. Adversaries watch for hesitation, and hesitation is legible. What looks internal from the inside looks like instability from the outside. Confidence doesn't vanish all at once. It thins. Quietly, transaction by transaction. Commitments start carrying conditions. Assurances require verification. Trust becomes provisional. This isn't about reputation, it's about risk. When the rule set of a powerful system appears negotiable, everyone downstream builds contingencies. Plans change, timelines stretch, costs rise. And here's the problem. Once the world adjusts to enforcement uncertainty, restoring authority becomes exponentially harder. Because the system isn't just trying to reassert control internally. It's trying to convince everyone else that control ever existed in the first place. That gap between perception and reality is where instability lives. And the future accelerates there. Because once recalculation starts, it doesn't wait for resolution. From here, the system has only a few possible paths. Not outcomes, trajectories. The first is adjustment. Enforcement slowly reasserts itself. Boundaries harden again, not dramatically, but enough to restore predictability. This path requires restraint, coordination, and time is already scarce. The second is erosion. Rules remain. Processes continue, but enforcement stays selective, uneven, negotiable. Authority exists, but only in theory. This is the most comfortable path and the most corrosive, because nothing breaks, it just stops holding. The third is rupture, a moment when containment fails, when delay no longer absorbs pressure, when the system is forced to choose between enforcement and legitimacy in real time, under stress. None of these paths announce themselves. They emerge through decisions made quietly, procedurally, under the justification of necessity. And here's the part that matters most. Once acceleration begins, the system doesn't get to pause and rethink. It moves in the direction already set. Which path becomes real depends on what happens next, and on whether enforcement returns before pressure becomes irreversible. That question remains unanswered, and it won't stay that way for long. This story doesn't end with a vote, or a ruling, or a single decision. Those are moments, not resolutions. What's being tested right now is simpler and more dangerous. Whether enforcement still exists when it becomes inconvenient, because systems don't survive on intention, they survive on follow-through. If authority can be ignored long enough, it stops being authority. It becomes memory. And once that happens, the question is no longer who broke the rules, but whether rules still function at all. That's not a theoretical problem. It's a practical one. It shapes how disputes are resolved, how power is constrained, how the next crisis unfolds. Nothing about this guarantees collapse. Nothing about it guarantees recovery. What it guarantees is that the next test will come faster and with less margin for error. So don't treat this as an ending. Treat it as a marker, because if enforcement doesn't return, something else always does. And the cost of finding out is never evenly distributed. If you want to understand what happens next, before it becomes obvious, stay with this. Because the moment everyone starts paying attention is usually after the system has already moved on.